Our military occupation of Japan was unique because as a conquering nation, we rejected force or even persuasion. We simply offered democracy. Japan, although steeped in the past, responded to this kind of treatment, and our military personnel were accepted more as friends than as conquerors. They, in turn, found much to appreciate in Japanese life. To them, mysterious Japan, closed to the world until the 19th century, became a friendly country, and a respect grew for the gentle way of life of the Japanese people. Troops stationed in Japan after the war found life here not always interesting or comfortable. Occupation duty was a job to be done and was far from home, and duty in the States often seemed highly desirable. Also, there were periods of stepped-up training, and these seemed hard to understand. After all, the war was over. Although, to some men, the routine of active training may have appeared not only endless, but pointless, there was method to these refresher courses, as later events were to prove. While these men were coupling their military training with occupation duties, another military force not far away was girding itself for a major invasion that would ultimately shake the free world into full realization of the nature of communism in the post-war world. The attack by communist troops eventually came, and many of these men who were here in Japan, primarily as occupation forces, were overnight in the thick of fighting in Korea, flown to the front to halt the Red invasion. The experience of these occupation troops, who were small in number compared to the enormous Red force that attacked South Korea, has been a lesson in preparedness. Ready as these men were, many were lost. They were not enough to stop the invasion at the outset, when it might have been stopped. Keeping a larger number of our troops in Japan on active training duty, prepared for defense in this area, was our initial reaction to the shock of Korea. Duty in Japan in 1952 was serious business. Training maneuvers readied troops for action in Korea. This was the primary reason for these military preparations. But there was another strategic reason for having troops here ready to defend and counterattack: the defense of Japan itself. With the war in Korea over, the danger to Japan continues, and men are needed on its beaches to fend off the enemy wherever he might strike. The expense of defending Japan with large numbers of our own ground troops mounted. Gradually, a new strategy began to evolve after the Korean War, based to a large degree on the developing techniques of troop transport by air. If necessary, we could fly large numbers of troops to the scene of new Soviet crimes. In this way, we would not be forced to place our forces in a long, thin defense line in the Western Pacific. The mobility of ground troops seemed to be one answer to the danger that the Reds might strike anywhere, anytime. There was no doubt of the value of having men and equipment ready to be flown on a moment's notice to areas under attack. But such troops could not alone defend us or Japan in the Western Pacific. Some troops were needed along a defense perimeter in order to continually discourage Soviet attack. Until recently, American troops have been used in Japan both for this local defense purpose and as a mobile air-transported fighting force. Not long ago, on Japan's northernmost island, Hokkaido, we maintained ground troops on a year-round basis. These forces patrolling the shores of Japan closest to Red-dominated territory are no longer in this front-line position of defense. Today, Hokkaido is not being guarded by American troops. Instead, the bulk of the American force, which has been required in Japan for purely local defense, is being gradually brought back to rear bases. The departure of many American troops from the Far East is part of a major change in U.S. strategy. Formerly, our policy was to commit large numbers of U.S. land forces in Asia to a degree that left us no strategic reserves. In effect, we spread our power thin. Now, we are bringing back many of our troops to reserve bases, such as Okinawa and Hawaii and the U.S. As a result, we will be better able to use our fighting forces with massive retaliatory power wherever communism strikes at the free world. Our new policy is to deter aggression by responding to communist attack with highly mobile, naval, air and amphibious units with greater effect than ever before. These troops, going back to Hawaii in most leisurely fashion, will be trained on these islands to retaliate instantly in Asia or elsewhere by means and at places of our choosing. Meanwhile, in Japan, local defense will be handled by the Japanese themselves. Back in 1946, the nucleus for the present Japanese military setup was a well-organized and trained police force. Just as in those days, we were anxious to see Japan maintain internal security, we are interested today in seeing the Japanese people well prepared to defend their homeland from outside attack. Back in the post-war years, we provided American instructors to help the Japanese police in their training. In a similar way, we are now guiding a new Japanese military organization so that it may become capable of undertaking the difficult responsibility of national defense. The National Police Reserve, which was formed to preserve order in Japan, had from the beginning many characteristics of a real army. Men enlisted for 2 years, lived in barracks, adhered to Army camp routine, and took part in formal military reviews. Discipline was encouraged, but not by a stick, a method of enforcement for which the old Imperial infantry was well known and feared. Instead of being drafted from the rice paddies, men were almost entirely volunteers, and morale as a result was good. Careful supervision by our occupation leaders prevented any possibility of a military organization being formed which did not serve the best interests of the Japanese people. Officers and men of the police reserve wore uniforms similar to those of the U.S. Army, and the organization itself followed the pattern of divisions, regiments, battalions, and companies. Out of this police organization came the National Safety Corps, presently called the Japanese Self-Defense Force, an army which we in America will regard with increasing interest for the role it will play in the defense of Japan and in our system of Western Pacific defense. The Japanese people turned out in full to watch their new army. It was different from the one that had paraded back in the days of imperial power. The men they saw were not the sullen types of the old army, soldiers contemptuous of the ordinary Japanese citizen. This was a different kind of Japanese in uniform, one whose first duty was not to the warlords, but to the Japanese people. Today, many problems lie ahead for this new army. Most important is the need for adequate equipment, which at present time her own industries cannot provide. Although we are helping to rebuild this Japanese force through our mutual defense agreement, more equipment is needed to match the increasing buildup of men and equipment in Asia by the Soviet Union and her satellites.